The battle took the alien princess's voice, until one human gave her the courage to speak again. The field hospital smelled like burnt copper and antiseptic, which was as close to home as corpsman first class Eden Voss had gotten in 14 months. He moved through the rows of cots with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned not to wake the ones who were finally sleeping. Most of them were Veth, the tall, slate-gray humanoids who made up the Covenant's ground forces. But there were humans here too, 3 of them, men from the 9th Expeditionary who had been caught in the same artillery collapse that had leveled the relay station at Keth-Vorran. The humans were doing better than the Veth, mostly. Humans had a way of absorbing punishment that never stopped surprising the Covenant medics, who had spent the first 2 months of the joint campaign updating their triage manuals to account for it. What read as critical on a Veth intake form often resolved in a human in under 48 hours. They were learning each other, all of them, human medics and Veth physicians and nurses from both species, assembled in this gray tent on a gray world, learning under circumstances that did not allow for the normal courtesies of learning. They didn't have time to ask the polite questions. They learned by doing and by watching, and occasionally by making mistakes and then finding better ways. Eden was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about the patient in cot 17. She had come in 6 days ago, carried by 2 Veth infantry officers who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, which told him everything he needed to know about her rank before he'd even looked at her. Veth didn't carry their own across fields. They dragged them, hauled them, slung them over shoulders with the blunt efficiency of soldiers who had no time for ceremony. When they carried someone important. When they wouldn't meet your eyes doing it, that someone was extraordinary. He had learned this in his first month on joint deployment, when a Veth officer had carried a wounded woman 3 kilometers through contested territory in complete silence, and then stood at the intake desk shaking with an emotion that was clearly immense and was being entirely suppressed. And the receiving nurse had whispered to Eden that the woman being carried was the officer's commanding general. The intake form said, Princess Kael-Sael, Princess of the Second Covenant House. Age, 34 cycles equivalent late 20s human standard. Injuries, percussive blast trauma right side, ruptured capillary clusters along the secondary vocal ridge, deep laceration left shoulder, concussion grade 3. She had been conscious when they brought her in. That was the part that still sat with Eden in his quieter moments. She had been conscious, and she had not made a single sound. Not from pain, not from fear. She had simply looked at him with eyes the color of hammered copper, a warm metallic amber, almost liquid, set in a face that was unmistakably Veth and unmistakably remarkable, and said nothing. He'd spoken to her in the standard Covenant tongue, which he had been forcing himself to learn since month 2 of deployment, waking up 20 minutes earlier every morning to sit with the language texts and repeat words into the gray dawn until they started to feel like words and not like sounds with arbitrary meanings. He'd told her his name. He'd told her what he was going to do. He'd promised it would hurt less than she expected. She had watched him with those copper eyes and not said a word. He'd assumed shock. He treated her for shock. He'd worked on the shoulder. The laceration was deep but clean, the kind that came from a secondary fragment rather than a direct hit, and drained and closed the blast trauma on her ribs, which were bruised to the deep internal structures and would hurt for weeks but had not broken. He'd administered the anticoncussive compound that the Veth medics called *Velsath, and that smelled like pine resin and old rain. He'd been careful and deliberate with the vocal ridge. The Veth vocal apparatus was external, a ridged structure along the side of the neck, shimmering faintly silver in health and dulled to a bruise gray in injury. Because the intake brief had flagged it as the most complex of her injuries, and because it looked, to his eye, like it hurt more than everything else combined. The capillaries along it were ruptured in a scatter pattern consistent with percussive overpressure, which meant the blast had been close and the pressure wave significant, and the fact that she was conscious and functional was either luck or something stronger than luck. When he'd finished, she had looked at him again. Still no sound. "Can you speak?" he'd asked in Covenant standard. She had shaken her head, slow, deliberate, and then she had looked away, toward the gray canvas wall of the field hospital, and that had been the end of the conversation. 6 days later, she still hadn't spoken. The medical consensus, assembled from 3 vet physicians and the human neural specialist who had been flown in from the 4th Army Medical Corps on day 3, was as follows. The percussive blast had not severed the vocal ridge. It had not destroyed the musculature that controlled it. The structures were intact, damaged but healing, and the prognosis for full recovery was, they said, in careful language that Eden had learned to translate as we aren't certain *, favorable. The problem was not physical. Dr. Herath, the neural specialist, had used the phrase *elective aphasia*, and then immediately revised it, because elective implied choice and choice implied ease, and neither of those words fit the princess at all. What he meant, he'd explained to Eden over cold ration coffee at midnight, was that the injury had created a break, a threshold, maybe, and something on the other side of that threshold was keeping her from crossing back. The Veth vocal ridge is tied to identity in a way human vocal cords aren't, Herath had said. For a Veth, your voice is your standing, your presence. They don't have surnames the way we do, they have voice signatures. Every Veth's voice is individually identifiable to anyone they've spoken with, and that identification is legally and socially binding. Contracts are sealed with it, oaths are ratified with it. When a Veth speaks your name, they are claiming a relationship with you that has formal weight. He had paused to drink his terrible coffee. A Veth who can't speak is, in a very real cultural sense, not, he had stopped, found a better word, not legible to their community. She knows that, her body knows that, and something in her is treating the act of speaking as a threshold she cannot cross. Because, Eden had asked. Because on the other side of that threshold is whatever she experienced in the battle. Herath had looked into his coffee. The blast didn't just hit her physically. Something happened out there that her mind has decided to keep silent about. And until she decides, or until something helps her decide, that it's safe to speak again, she won't. Eden had gone back to cot 17 and looked at her sleeping, and he had felt something that he didn't have a name for yet settle somewhere in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He was good at not naming things until he was sure of them. He was good at patience. He had been good at patience since he was 12 years old, and his mother had told him that the problem with people who rushed toward things was that they often arrived before the thing was ready for them. He was also good, which was rarer, at knowing when patience was not passivity, when it was simply presence. The art of being beside someone without making demands of them. The art he'd learned not from any medical training, but from 6 years of sitting with patients in their worst hours, and discovering that the most important thing he could do in those hours was stay. He didn't push her. That was the first thing. Everyone else who came to see her, the Veth physicians, the 2 officers who had carried her in and who visited every morning with the careful distress of people who felt responsible for something they hadn't been able to prevent. A young Veth woman with a junior aide sash who always left looking stricken. 2 senior officers from the Joint Command who came once and never came back. They all pushed her. They didn't mean to. They asked if she could speak yet, or looked at her with barely concealed anxiety, or spoke too loudly and too carefully as if her silence were deafness, or explained to her with the particular helpless energy of worried people that it was important she recover, as though she did not know this. She would watch them with those copper eyes and simply wait for them to finish. Eden didn't ask. He checked her ridge every morning with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, assessing the healing capillaries against a scale he'd drawn up himself, because the Veth physiological manuals had 3 pages on vocal ridge trauma, and none of them had a practical metric. He changed the dressing on her shoulder. He updated her chart. He told her what he was doing and why, in the same calm tone he used with every patient. Here's what I'm doing. Here's why it will help. Here's what you might feel. and when he was done he said good morning and moved on. On the third day, she had turned her head to watch him walk away. He hadn't noticed until one of the vet nurses mentioned it, in a tone that suggested this was significant. He had filed it away and said nothing. On the fourth day, he had brought her a cup of *Velsath and set it beside her cot without comment. The drink was medicinal, but the vet seemed to find it comforting. It was the kind of thing you were given after a hard day when you were a child. One of the nurses had explained, the way humans gave warm tea or warm milk. He wasn't sure if offering it to her was appropriate or overstepping a cultural line he didn't know was there. He'd thought about it for an hour before deciding that a cup of something warm was worth the risk of being wrong. She had looked at the cup for a long moment, a long enough moment that he wondered if he had been wrong after all. Then she had picked it up with both hands, the way the nurses held theirs, 2 hands wrapped around the base, the warmth held between the palms, and she had breathed the steam before she drank it. It was not speaking, but it was something. On the 5th day, he had run out of painkillers for the soldier in cot 4, a young Veth man named Keldaret who had lost 2 fingers and was being heroically stoic about it in a way that made Eden's jaw tight. And he had gone hunting through the supply crates at the back of the tent, with the focused aggression of a man who knew something was in there, and was going to find it regardless of how badly the inventory was organized. He had knocked over a stack of secondary crates and caught them before they fell, barely, and had muttered something under his breath that was not suitable for polite company in any language. From cot 17, very faintly, there had been a sound. He had frozen, turned. She was looking at him. Her expression was not quite amusement, not quite, but something in the vicinity of it, something that lived near the corner of her mouth and the angle of her copper eyes. And it was the first thing he had seen on her face in 5 days that wasn't the careful blank of someone waiting for everyone to leave. He had held up the crate. "Supply organization," he said by way of explanation. "Someone needs to answer for this." The almost expression deepened slightly. She looked from him to the crate and back again, and her eyes had the quality of someone who had once been in charge of things and still reflexively assessed organizational problems. He found the painkillers. He took them to cot 4. When he came back past cot 17, she was still watching the supply crates with an expression that was definitely, unmistakably, something in the neighborhood of humor, and he decided that this was the best day he'd had in 3 months. The 6th day was when he found the book. He had been sorting through a crate of items recovered from the relay station, personal effects, things that would need to go back to families, things that were technically medical supply but had been shoved into a crate without categorization, because the soldiers doing the clearing had been working under fire, and stopping to label things was not a priority when people were shooting at you. In among the detritus, a canteen, 2 datapads that had taken enough damage to be unrecoverable, a small carved figure in the style Eden associated with the Northern Veth territories, a standard issue kit with the clasp bent. He found a small bound volume, Veth script. The cover was a deep blue-gray with a pressed pattern of something that might have been a coastal plant. The title meant *Songs of the Keth-Vorran*, which he translated slowly and probably wrong, but the words were close enough to be right. He turned it over in his hands, looked at the unclaimed items list. It wasn't on there. He looked at cot 17. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen before, something complicated and still, the way water looked just before a change in weather, not stormy, not calm, but suspended between states, waiting for the thing that would push it one way or the other. Her hands had moved. They were no longer at her sides. They were slightly raised, not reaching, not quite, but the gesture of hands that had recognized something. He crossed to her cot. He held up the book, question in his eyes rather than words, because he had learned in 6 days that she responded better to questions that didn't require an answer. Her hands came up the rest of the way. She took it from him carefully, Very carefully, the way you took something you thought might not be real, something you had been looking for and had stopped expecting to find, and held it in her lap for a moment without opening it. Her jaw moved. Her vocal ridge, he could see it from here, faintly shimmering now where before it had been entirely dulled, the healing beginning, shifted slightly, the way it did when Veth were about to speak and then stopped themselves, the small muscular prelude to a word that didn't arrive. He sat down on the edge of the empty cot beside hers, not close, not hovering, just present the way he'd learned to be present in the hours when presence was the only useful thing. "You don't have to tell me where it came from," he said, "or anything. I just thought it might be yours." She looked at him. Then she looked at the book. She opened it, and he caught a glimpse of interior pages covered in close-written script, the characters smaller and more informal than formal Veth writing, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a private document rather than an official one. At the bottom of one page, in different ink darker, a deep blue, a small drawing, coastal plants, he thought, or something like them. The kind of drawing someone made while they were thinking about something else. She closed it, put it flat against her chest, both hands pressed over the cover, the way someone held something they were afraid might leave again. Eden stood up. "Good evening," he said, and went back to work. He didn't see her expression after he turned away. He would have wanted to. The Veth officer came on the morning of the 7th day, and he was the problem. Eden had been briefed on him by the senior Veth physician, Commander Vel Ruoth, the ranking military liaison for the Second Covenant House, which meant in practical terms that he was the person responsible for getting the princess home intact and making sure the official record of her presence in a human field hospital was as short and uncomplicated as possible. He was tall even by Veth standards, slate gray with a faint blue iridescence at his temples that indicated high blood lineage, and he looked at everything in the tent with the careful disdain of someone who had been raised to believe that patience with lesser circumstances was a form of dignity, and was currently deploying that patience at some cost. He came to cot 17 with 2 aides and a Veth physician from the capital whom Eden hadn't met before, and he stood at the foot of her cot and spoke to her for 4 minutes in a Veth dialect that was above Eden's level of comprehension but whose shape he could follow from body language alone. He was not unkind. He was careful. He was treating her, Eden could see, with the particular consideration that very powerful people gave to the slightly more powerful than them when they wanted something. He was also, unmistakably, informing her that she needed to be well enough to be moved, and that her silence was a matter of concern to the house, and that her house was waiting for her return and could not wait indefinitely. She watched him the way she watched everything, copper eyes still, measuring. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly. She said nothing. Vel Ruoth's jaw tightened. He looked at the capital physician. The physician said something quiet in the upper dialect that Eden caught as a medical reassurance. Asterisk, the healing is progressing, asterisk, which didn't help Vel Ruoth's expression. He looked back at her. He said something else, shorter, harder, that Eden's limited vocabulary parsed as something like "your house needs your voice," or possibly "your silence dishonors your house," asterisk, and he wasn't entirely certain which, but either way. He stepped forward. "Commander," Eden said. Vel Ruoth turned. The temperature in the tent dropped approximately 3 degrees. He looked at Eden the way senior officers sometimes looked at line medics, with the particular surprise of someone who was not accustomed to interruption from that direction. "Corpsman," the word in Covenant Standard, was precise and cold. "This is a house matter." "She's my patient," Eden said, "and she's not cleared for stress." "I am not here to stress her. I am here to—" "You're standing at the foot of her cot raising your voice to someone with a grade 3 concussion and a healing vocal ridge." Eden kept his own voice even. He had not raised it. He didn't need to. He had found, over 6 years in the Corps, that the quieter he was in these moments the more effective he became. Something about stillness in the face of volume that changed the shape of a conversation. "With respect, Commander, What you're here for is going to have to wait. Velruoth looked at him with the expression of someone encountering a piece of furniture that had unexpectedly developed opinions. Human. Voss, corpsman First Class Eden Voss. He held Velruoth's gaze. She's not cleared for discharge. I'll update you when she is. The silence stretched. The two aides looked at the middle distance. The capital physician looked at the ceiling. Velruoth looked from Eden to the princess, who was watching all of this with an expression Eden couldn't fully parse, the copper eyes active in a way they hadn't been in 7 days, and then back to Eden. He said something in Veth to his aides that Eden didn't catch, and then he turned and walked out of the tent with the controlled precision of someone who was furious and had excellent manners. The capital physician lingered for a moment. She looked at Eden with an expression that was more readable, assessment and something adjacent to approval. Then she followed. Eden stood at the end of the bed for a moment. Then he turned to look at her. She was still watching him. The copper eyes were different now. He wasn't sure how exactly, but different. Less still. Something in them that was not the careful waiting, but something more like active attention. The kind you gave something you hadn't expected. He'll come back, Eden said, and I'll probably have to clear you eventually. A pause. Not today. He went back to work. She started leaving her cot on the 8th day. He noticed first because her charts showed she'd had a restless night, which usually meant pain. But when he came to check, she was sitting up and her vital signs were better than they'd been since she'd arrived. She was looking at the book, the asterisk songs of the Keth-Vorran, open to a page somewhere in the middle. She looked up when he approached and then looked back at the page, which he took to mean he was welcome to proceed with the check. He found her later that morning standing at the flap of the tent looking out at the gray-brown landscape of Keth-Vorran. The planet was largely coastal industrial in the north where they were stationed, the terrain a mix of scrubland and volcanic rock, and from this position you could see, through the permanent light haze that hung over the eastern grid, the shapes of the mountains. She was standing with the book pressed against her chest, and she was looking at those shapes with the quality of attention that Eden associated with people who were working through something and needed a fixed point. He stood beside her, not too close. The mountains here are called something, he said. I can't pronounce it. Kel-Darrat, the patient who lost the fingers, cot 4. He tried to teach me once and gave up after about 45 seconds. He considered. I may have mispronounced the word for asterisk mountain so badly that it sounded like an insult to his mother. He wouldn't confirm or deny. Nothing. But she turned her head slightly, and the angle of it was the angle of someone listening rather than merely not leaving. The Veth have a different word for mountains than we do, he continued. We say mountain and it's just geography. The word he was teaching me, it was something like asterisk Keth-Vorran asterisk, but I was definitely wrong. It means something closer to what was here before the world learned its shape asterisk. He paused. I might be making that up. My Veth is not great. The corner of her mouth moved, very slightly, a motion that on a more expressive face would have been a faint smile. He looked out at the mountains. There are mountains on Earth, he said. Where I'm from, a part called Kaskala Province, it's on the western coast. Ocean on one side, mountains on the other, and on clear days you can stand at the water's edge and see both at once. I used to think that was too much for one view, greedy, the kind of scenery that couldn't make up its mind. He paused. Now I think maybe that's the whole point. Too much is sometimes exactly enough. She had turned to look at him while he talked. When he stopped, she was still looking at him, and her expression was something he was starting to learn, the particular look she had when she was deciding something. Not dramatic, just present, eyes slightly different than still. Sorry, he said. I talk when I'm trying not to say what I'm actually thinking. Her brows, faint, barely their things on her Veth face, 2 shades darker than her gray skin, moved. Slightly. He was becoming fluent in slight. She had a vocabulary of slight that he thought most people would miss entirely if they weren't paying close attention, and he was paying close attention. He went back inside. He thought about what he'd been actually thinking and decided it was better left where it was for now. On the 10th day, one of the vet nurses came to find him in the middle of a procedure and told him, quietly and urgently, that there was something he should know. The battle at Keth-Vorran, the relay station collapse, the artillery strike that had brought down the structure and sent 53 soldiers to field hospitals across the eastern grid, had not been random. The Covenant's intelligence division had spent a week reconstructing the sequence, and what they'd found was that the strike had been targeted. The relay station had been chosen because intelligence suggested it was the most likely location for a route command briefing. And the route command briefing had been chosen as the target because it was the confirmed location of the heir of the second Covenant house. Someone had tried to kill her specifically. The strike had hit the West Wing where the briefing was held. She had survived because she had stepped outside 3 minutes before impact. The nurse, relaying this from an officer who shouldn't have been talking, said she'd received a communication from her aide about a logistics amendment that needed her authorization. She'd stepped outside to take the communication in better signal. She'd been standing near the east corner of the relay station, 30 meters from the west wall, when the strike hit. Close enough to be thrown by the overpressure wave, close enough to see the west wall go. Close enough to hear the people inside, her staff, her briefing officers, her personal escort, close enough to hear all of them at once, in the single second between the blast and the silence that followed it. 17 people. Eden stood with this information for a long moment. He thanked the nurse. He finished the procedure he was in the middle of because the soldier on the table needed him to finish it, and the soldier on the table was what was in front of him. When he was done, he sat for 10 minutes outside the tent in the gray morning air and thought about thresholds. Because on the other side of that threshold is whatever she experienced in the battle. He thought about what it would cost to speak. About a voice being identity, being presence, being legibility, being the thing that made you real to your community and your culture and yourself. He thought about what it meant to be the only one who walked out, to carry 17 names that no one else in that moment was carrying, to return to a world that still had words for things when the last sound you remembered clearly was a sound that had no words at all. He thought about silence as not merely absence, but as something you held, actively held, because it was the last boundary between you and having to make that experience real with language. He thought about a woman who had watched him for 10 days with copper eyes and not spoken a word, and he understood, in a way that had nothing to do with medical training, that the silence was not a symptom. It was a decision, and the decision was not wrong. Then he went back inside. He didn't say anything that night. He did her evening check. He gave her the *Velsath*. He said good evening and moved on. He didn't say anything the next morning either, or that afternoon. What he did, and he wasn't sure why, wasn't sure it was the right thing, was operating on something that wasn't medical training but was something older and quieter. The thing he'd been doing for 6 years when everything else ran out, was bring his own things to Cot 17. He had a battered notebook. He carried it everywhere, had carried it for 6 years in the Corps, filled it with observations and notes and occasionally personal things in a handwriting so small and dense that no one who hadn't worked beside him for months could read it. The pages near the front were full. The pages in the middle documented the early days of joint deployment, the things he'd noticed about Veth physiology and culture, sketches of the anatomical structures he was learning. The pages in the back were letters to his sister, written but rarely sent, because the writing was the thing and the sending was secondary. He sat in the chair beside her cot and he wrote, not about her. He wrote a letter to his sister, which he did every few weeks in the periods when the deployment ground on, and the things he'd seen accumulated, and he needed somewhere to put them that wasn't inside himself. His sister was 3 years older and lived in the same coastal province he'd grown up in and had opinions about everything, and was the person he thought of when he thought of the word asterisk home, and writing to her was the closest he got to being there. The princess watched him. She had started watching him with a different quality of attention than she'd watched the others, not the waiting for it to end attention, but something more present, more particular. The attention you gave things you were genuinely trying to understand. At one point he made a mistake in a sentence, wrote the same word twice, and crossed it out with the small controlled aggression he always brought to errors, and he heard it again. That faint sound from her direction, the sound that lived near humor and nowhere near speech but was undeniably something, and not nothing. He looked up. "I know," he said. "I can't write a letter to save my life either." She looked at him. Then she looked at the book on her lap, the asterisk songs of the Keth-Vorran asterisk, and something moved across her face that he recognized as a decision arriving. He waited. "The battle," he said. Her eyes came up to him immediately. She was very still, the absolute quality of stillness that was not absence but presence at maximum tension. "I know what happened," he said. "Not from you, I want to be clear about that. I know the facts of it. I know why you're here and what you saw." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to ask you to tell me about it. I'm not going to ask you to do anything. He stopped. Found the honest version, the one without softening. "I wanted you to know that I know, so you don't have to carry it alone in a room where everyone's pretending the war only hit your body." The stillness on her face changed. He couldn't have said how. It was the way stillness changed when something inside it shifted, when what had been surface became depth, when what had been a held breath became a breath that had decided something. 17 people, he said quietly, and you walked out. Her eyes went very bright. Veth's eyes didn't fill with tears the way human eyes did. The mechanism was different, an internal membrane that shifted and darkened the iris when the body registered the physiological state that humans associated with tears. But something in her copper irises deepened, the color going darker, the warm amber going towards bronze, the way metal looked when the light changed. "That's not something that has words for a while," he said. "Maybe for a very long while, and that's," he exhaled. "That's all right, you don't owe anyone words." He looked back down at his notebook. She didn't speak. He hadn't expected her to. He hadn't said it to provoke speech. He'd said it because it was true and she needed someone to say it. And he'd decided, sitting outside in the gray morning air, that he was going to be that person. When he looked up again a few minutes later, she had opened the asterisk songs of the Keth-Vorran to a page near the middle, and her finger was tracing one line of text, slowly, the way you trace something you knew by heart, and her lips were moving, very slightly, silently, shaping words that weren't yet ready to be sounds. She was reading the words without releasing them, keeping them just below the threshold of voice. He watched for one moment and then looked away. Some things were not for witnesses. The crisis came on the 12th day. Velrueth returned with orders. Not verbal this time, official documents, sealed with the Second Covenant House cipher, authorizing her transfer to the capital medical facility at Velharath effective in 48 hours. He presented them to the senior Veth physician, who presented them to Eden, who read them twice, and understood that there was no medical authority in this field hospital that could override a house cipher. It was not a request. It had the weight of a formal decree, which in covenant law was the weight of the house itself. He told her that afternoon. He had made the decision, without fully thinking it through, following the same instinct that had led him to the other decisions in the last 12 days, to be honest with her rather than manage her, because she was not someone who responded to management, and because she deserved the truth, and because he had come to the private conclusion, somewhere in the last 10 days, that treating her like someone who needed protection from information was an insult to what she'd already survived. He watched her face when he told her. What he saw there was complicated, not fear, not exactly. Something more like a fortress making the calculations of holding against a siege it knew it couldn't win, assessing the terrain, measuring the distance, deciding what it could save and what it would have to leave. She looked at the tent wall. She pressed the book against her chest. She breathed. 48 hours, he said. Your ridge is at 63% healed. Structurally, it'll hold the transfer. You'll have a full medical team at Velharath. He paused. I'll file the best discharge notes I know how to write. She looked at him. The capital facility is good, he said. Better than here in every measurable way. She kept looking at him. He looked back. I know that's not what you're worried about. She blinked. The slow, deliberate blink that he'd come to understand was her version of yes, the small, precise affirmation of someone who had stripped their communication down to the things that couldn't be misread. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the things he was not going to say, ran through them quickly, and found the one that was appropriate. You could write to me, he said, when you're if you want. The Corps has a forwarding address. It follows me around. A pause. I'm not much of a correspondent, my sister would tell you, but I do, he stopped, found the honest version. I do write back. Something happened on her face. Something he had been watching build for 12 days arrived, finally, at the surface. Not quite like a wave, more like a tide, the slow, inevitable kind that didn't announce itself until it was already there. It was not the almost amusement or the studied stillness or the complicated reading the weather expression. It was something simpler than any of those, and therefore more difficult. The expression of someone who had spent 12 days deciding whether to trust something and had just, quietly, decided. She moved her hand. It was a small motion, practiced, deliberate. The Veth gesture he'd seen the nurses make when they were thanking someone for something real. A half-arc of the open hand that didn't translate exactly to any human gesture, but meant something in the neighborhood of I receive this, and something else in the neighborhood of I give this back. He'd seen it directed at other people. He'd never had it directed at him. He held her gaze for a moment. Get some sleep, he said. You've got a long day tomorrow. He went back to work. He did not let himself think about the 48 hours. He was very good, when he needed to be, at not thinking about things. He'd been good at it since the first really bad day in the Corps, when he'd realized that thinking about things at the wrong time was exactly as useful as not thinking about them at the right time, and that the skill was in knowing which was which. The night before her transfer, he was in the middle of his last rounds when he heard it. It was not loud. It would not have been audible over the ambient sound of the tent if the tent had not happened to be, in that particular moment, quiet. Most of the patients asleep. The Veth nurses on the far end occupied with a dressing change. The wind outside doing the thing it did on Keth-Vorran nights where it dropped to almost nothing, and the whole landscape went still, as if the planet itself was listening. It was a single word, in Veth. His Veth was not good enough to catch it precisely, but it had the cadence of a name, the particular cadence of something personal rather than formal, the shape that words took in the mouth when they were being said to someone who couldn't hear them anymore. A word spoken not to the air but into it, the way prayers were spoken, the way some things were spoken. He turned. She was sitting up in cot 17. She was looking at the book in her hands, open to the same page she'd been tracing earlier. Her mouth was open slightly, and the sound, if it had been a sound, had already ended, absorbed back into the quiet. She looked up and found him watching. Her expression was something he had no word for. He did not think there was a human word for it. It was the expression of someone who had just stepped across a threshold and found, to their surprise, and perhaps to their relief, that the ground on the other side held, that it did not give way, that they were still standing. He did not say anything. He turned back to his rounds. He could feel, with the part of him that was always paying attention even when the rest of him was occupied, that she was watching him go. He finished his rounds. He wrote up his charts. He sat outside for a while in the cold Keth-Vorran night, looking at the shapes of the mountains through the haze, what was here before the world learned its shape, and he thought about things he wasn't going to let himself think about yet, and then he went inside and slept. The transfer convoy arrived at first light. There were 4 vehicles and a full Covenant military escort, more than was typical for a medical transfer, which meant that whoever was coordinating her security had received updated intelligence about the threat level, which meant the 48 hours had not been merely bureaucratic. Vel-Ruth was present, more reserved than Eden had seen him, the controlled containment of someone managing a situation that was larger than the room they were in. 2 officers from the Joint Command, Dr. Vel-Ruth from the capital, the careful young physician who had come with Vel-Ruth's first visit and who had, when Eden filed his discharge notes, sent back a brief message that said only, "I will follow the protocol exactly. Thank you." He had decided he approved of her. He walked her discharge through. He went over her care notes with Dr. Vel-Ruth, who asked intelligent questions and wrote down the answers. He went over the Ridge recovery protocol in detail, the metrics he'd developed, the indicators to watch. He made sure they had the Vel-Sath blend he'd been using, because the capital facility would have their standard version, and nobody ever believed him that the standard version was less effective until they checked. Dr. Vel-Ruth checked. She made a note. Princess Kael-Sael, Vel-Mira, the formal title. Her given name was what people used, what her aide called her, what the nurses had quietly begun to use after the 4th or 5th day, was dressed in the clothes her aide had brought. Dark gray, fitted, the formal register of her house, but understated in the way that people from genuinely old houses tended to be understated, because they had nothing to prove to the room. The clothes had been waiting for 12 days in the aide's bag. She wore them with the ease of someone who had worn clothes like them all her life, which she had. She looked more herself than she had in 12 days. She also looked, he thought, slightly terrified in the precise way that someone looked terrified when they were very good at not showing it, and you had spent 12 days learning their vocabulary of slight. He brought her the final discharge form. She reviewed it with the focused attention she brought to everything, her eyes moving across the Covenant standard text with the speed of someone who was accustomed to reading documents and assessing them. Then she looked up at him. He held out the stylus. She took it. Signed her name in Veth script, the characters flowing and decisive, the signature of someone who had been signing official documents since she was old enough to hold a stylus, and had developed the confidence that came with repetition. She handed it back. He looked at the signature, he looked at her. Vel-Mira Kael-Sael *, he read, mangling the pronunciation in at least 2 places. That's a complicated name. She looked at him. Then slowly she pointed at herself, a single clear gesture. Then she pointed at him. A question. Simple, direct, the kind of question she had learned to ask in the last 12 days without needing words. He understood. She was asking for his name, his given name, the one he'd offered on the first day when she hadn't been able to take it. "Eden," he said. "Just Eden." She looked at him with those copper eyes. Then she did the thing with her hand again, the half-arc, "I receive this, I give this back *, but slower this time. More deliberate, like she was making sure it landed the way she intended it. He wanted to say something. He had several things he wanted to say, and none of them were appropriate for a field hospital discharge, and 1 or 2 of them he wasn't ready to say anyway, and he knew the difference between things that were ready and things that weren't. "Take care of the Ridge," he said. "The capital team is good. Follow the protocol." She nodded. And he paused, found the one thing he actually wanted to say. "When you find your words again, don't rush them. They'll come when they're ready." She was very still. Her jaw worked slightly. The Ridge, he could see it, better than it had been, the shimmering quality returning in patches, the bruise gray giving way in places to the silver it was supposed to be, moved. He waited. She breathed in. And in the quiet of the field hospital on the morning before the convoy left, in a voice that was rough and careful and unfamiliar with the shape of itself after 12 days of silence, in a voice that had been still so long it had forgotten it knew how to move, and was remembering now. She said his name. Just his name, Eden. The sound of it hit him somewhere he hadn't been expecting. It landed in the same place the stone had landed 10 days ago, when he'd stood at her cot and let himself be quietly rearranged by the fact of her. And it sat there, warm and exact, the way things sat when they were exactly where they were supposed to be. He kept his face still. He was very good at that. "There it is," he said quietly. "There's your voice." Her eyes darkened, the way they'd darkened the night he told her he knew, met his. She was not the same as she'd been 12 days ago, and she was not the same as the moment before she'd spoken, and she was carrying things that were going to take a very long time to put down. She was alive. She was here and she was speaking, and the threshold was behind her now, and she had crossed it in her own time and in her own way, and the sound of his name in her voice was still in the air between them. "It sounds different," she said, in covenant standard that was accented and careful and real, choosing words the way you chose them when you were being precise about something that mattered. "My voice. It sounds different than I remember." "Voices do that," he said. "After something, they come back changed a little." He paused. "They're still yours." She absorbed this. She looked at the book, the asterisk songs of the Keth-Vorran asterisk, which she held pressed against her chest with one hand, both hands again, the familiar hold. "These were my mother's," she said. "The songs. She stopped. Her throat moved. "She taught me the second one before I could read. Before I could read any Veth, any text at all, I knew that song. I used to sing it to myself when I was afraid." A pause, careful and deliberate. "I tried to sing it in the tent, the night before last, in the dark when no one was there." He said nothing. "I could only find one word," she said, "but I found it." Her eyes met his, the copper gone warm with something he recognized as its own kind of brightness. "I found it." "I know," he said. "I heard it." The convoy was ready. Velruith was waiting with the particular patience of someone who had decided to make the best of not being in charge of the timeline. Dr. Velarath had her kit and her notes and her copy of the recovery protocol, and the note about the asterisk Velsath asterisk blend. The aide had the bags. The escort was assembled, checking formation with the quiet precision of people who had been briefed on the threat level and were taking it seriously. He walked with her to the convoy. He stopped at the edge of the field hospital's jurisdiction, demarcated by a line of supply crates and a faded painted marker on the ground that had always struck him as optimistic. She stopped beside him. "The address," she said. "Your forwarding address." He looked at her. He had forgotten he'd mentioned that. He had half assumed she had too, and understood now that she hadn't, that she had been holding it the same way she held most things, carefully, in a place where it would keep. He pulled a small card from his pocket. He kept them there for exactly this, for the families, for the handoffs, for the people who needed a place to send things, and held it out. She took it without looking at it. She looked at him instead. "I'll write," she said. It was not a question. It was not quite a promise either. It was the thing that lives between those two, the thing that people say when they mean "I intend to" and "I want to" and "I am going to try very hard" and are being honest about all three parts. "I know," he said. She looked at him one more moment, measuring, reading, doing the thing she did with her eyes when she was committing something to memory. Then she turned and walked toward the convoy, and he watched her go, steady, upright, the book against her chest, the gray world of Keth-Vorran around her in the early light, and the sound of his name in her voice was still there, still in the air, the way sounds sometimes stayed longer than sounds had any right to stay. He stood at the marker until the convoy was out of sight. Then he went back inside and got to work. The letter came 63 days later. It found him at the 12th Forward Station first, then followed to the orbital medical depot at Harathvel, and then, because the Veth courier systems were better than the human ones, which was a standing joke in the joint forces and was, as far as Eden could tell, simply true. It caught him on a layover at Keth-Vorran base 3 days before the 12th forward standard delivery window should have allowed it. He didn't ask how. He sat down with it. It was written in Covenant standard, careful and precise, in handwriting that had the quality of someone who was choosing every word, not because they were uncertain of them, but because they understood that the words they were choosing mattered and intended to treat them accordingly. Corpsman vos asterisk. My ridge is at 94%. Dr. Velarath says full recovery before the cycle turns. I have been told that my voice sounds different to the people who knew it before. You said they were still mine. I have decided to believe you. The capital is. It is large. There are people here who look at me as though they are waiting for me to crack, which I understand is a form of care that does not know how to say what it means. I try to understand this. The ones who were not at Keth-Vorran do not know what to do with someone who came back different, which is perhaps fair, as I did not know what to do with it myself for a long time and in some ways am still learning. I sing the second song now. I sang it in my rooms last week. My aide heard it and stood in the corridor for a long time without coming in. I think it meant something to her that it was there again. I am not sure I know how to ask if I am right about that, but I think I am. I have thought often about the mountains, what was here before the world learned its shape. I think you are making up the translation. I also think it is the right translation, and I am keeping it. I have not spoken about Keth-Vorran to anyone except you and Dr. Velarath, and even that was limited and careful. My house's grief committee has asked to meet. I am told this is the formal process. They sit with you and you say the names and they receive them. I have been told it helps. I am not ready. I thought I should be honest about that because you have been honest with me and I want to be honest with you. I am told you are at Harithvel. I am told the 12th forward has been extended. I wanted to say, before I lost the moment to say it. Thank you, not for the ridge, not for standing between me and Velruith, although that was, I have thought about that often too. You sat beside a person who had no words and treated her as though she had them. You did not wait for me to be legible to speak to me. You spoke into the silence as though it were a language you understood, and in doing so you made it one. I did not know before that this was something a person could do. I intend to write again. I thought you should know that I intend to. VMKS asterisk. He read it 3 times. He sat with it for a day. Then he got out his notebook and wrote a letter back. A real one, a sent one, and thought, while he wrote, about voices finding their way back, about thresholds, about the particular patience required to sit beside someone in their hardest moment without trying to fix it before it was ready to be fixed. He wrote about the mountains at Harithvel, younger and sharper than Keth-Vorran's, still deciding what they were. He wrote about Keldarat, who had been discharged with prosthetic fingers, and had made an extremely rude gesture with them on his way out that had been the funniest thing Eden had seen in 6 months, and who had told him before leaving that the human medic who treated him was Velsath asterisk, a Veth compliment of the highest order, which Eden had accepted with a straight face and confirmed with a nurse afterward. He wrote 94% is excellent. You'll have 100 before you expect it. Don't count the days, they move faster when you're not watching them. He wrote, the grief committee can wait as long as you need it to. There is no correct speed for what you're carrying. You'll know when you're ready because it will feel possible rather than required, and that distinction matters. He wrote, you sang the second song. Your aide stood in the corridor. I think you know what to do, you just haven't decided to trust that you know yet. That's not the same as not knowing. That's just time. He signed it. Asterisk Eden Voss, Corpsman First Class, in a slightly warmer tint than Keth-Vorran, which is admittedly a low bar. He sent it, he went back to work. He thought, in the spaces between things, in the quiet after rounds, in the gray mornings, in the moments between a procedure ending and the next beginning. about a woman who had found one word in the dark and held onto it, about what that cost, about what it meant that she had offered it, finally, carefully, in the early light of a field hospital departure morning, to him. He thought about what it meant that she had said his name. He thought these things in the particular way of someone who understood that some things were not ready yet, and that not ready was not the same as not real, and that the most important things often took exactly as long as they needed to, and not one moment less. The second letter came 41 days after the first. It began Eden. Just his name. No title, no formal salutation, no asterisk corpsman vos asterisk. Just the name in her handwriting, the Covenant Standard letters, careful and particular. The way she'd said it aloud in the field hospital, rough and careful and unfamiliar with the shape of itself, and entirely her own. He sat with that for a long time before he read the rest. The rest was long. The longest letter he'd received in years. Longer than his sister's letters, which were long because his sister had opinions about everything and time to develop them. This was different. This was the length of someone who had been carrying something in silence and had finally, having decided to trust the person across the distance, found the words for it. She wrote about Keth-Vorran. Not the facts but the feeling, the texture of the 3 minutes she'd been standing outside, the way the light had looked on the eastern scrubland, the way she'd been thinking about nothing in particular when the sound arrived before the force of the blast reached her. The second of silence after, which had seemed very long. Then the understanding, arriving in pieces, of what the silence meant. She wrote the names, all 17 of them in Veth script, with a single thing she remembered about each person, not an obituary, something smaller and more personal. The aide who had been afraid of heights but never let anyone see it. The briefing officer who brought her Velsath without being asked. She wrote them all, and Eden read them all and let them be the weight they were. She wrote, I sang the whole song. On the 32nd day. All the way through alone. I don't know why I'm telling you this except that you're the only one who would understand what the 32nd day means, and what it meant to find that the song was still there. All of it. Still in me where I'd left it. She wrote the grief committee met. Some of them had also been carrying names in silence. I said mine. They said theirs. I had been afraid it would feel like performance. It did not. It felt like the names were being held by more hands than just mine, and that helped in a way I had not known anything could help. And at the end, you wrote that the direction was clear. I have been thinking about it for 41 days. I have a question, and I am going to ask it in a letter because some things are easier in letters. I think you understand this. Would you come to the capital when your deployment allows it? Not officially. Not as a medical matter. There is a coast here, the Velharath coast, and a place where you can stand at the edge of the water and see the mountains behind you and the open ocean in front of you. It is a great deal for one view. I find myself thinking it might be exactly enough. I thought you should decide for yourself. He read this last part 3 times. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote, yes. He thought about it for another day. He wrote, I will come. Then he wrote the rest of the letter. About the Harathvel Mountains and their geological youth. About Keldarat's rude prosthetic gestures and the minor tradition they'd apparently become. About the asterisk Velsath at the depot, which was exactly as bad as he'd predicted. He wrote about his sister's ongoing fence dispute, which had apparently escalated to involve historical precedent and questions of what a fence said about a person's character. He wrote about things you said when you were learning the shape of someone across distance, carefully, the way you did anything that mattered. He wrote, I am not a person who moves quickly toward things. You may have noticed this. But I have been thinking about too much for one view, and exactly enough, and I believe you are right about both. I would like to find out for myself. He signed it, Eden, just his name, the way she'd written hers. He sent it, he went back to work. But for the rest of the deployment, and for the 43 days after it that it took to arrange passage to the capital world, He carried the sound of it with him, the sound of her voice, rough and careful, finding the one word it needed in the gray, early light of Keth-Vorran. The word had been his name, and it had stayed in the air the way some things stayed, the right things, the things that were the beginning of something and knew it. He carried it all the way to the Velharath coast. And when he got there, and stood at the water's edge with the mountains behind him and the open ocean in front of him, and turned to find her standing beside him with the asterisk songs of the Keth shore pressed against her chest, and the copper eyes warm in the coastal light, he understood, the way you understood things you'd been patient with long enough, that it was exactly enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.